The waterfall had roared for 1,000 years before anyone thought to look behind it. But on a cold October afternoon in 1889, a young woman pressed her back against dripping stone, inched through a crack in the cliff, and stepped into a silence the rest of the world had forgotten completely. She was not alone. Owen Mercer used to say that a man without land was just a man passing through, borrowing someone else's ground, leaving no mark, carrying nothing forward. He was 27 years old and had spent his whole life passing through. His new wife, Sadie, understood that feeling better than anyone. She had grown up in borrowed rooms, in other people's houses, and she had married Owen partly because he was the first person who ever made her feel like she was exactly where she belonged. They had been married 11 weeks when they left the last town. It was a place called Granton, in the low country east of the mountains, where Owen had worked a cattle ranch for nearly 2 years. The work had been honest, and the pay just barely enough. But in late August, the ranch owner sold the property to a land company from back east, and that company had no use for a ranch hand and his new wife living in the foreman's cottage. They were given 2 weeks and a handshake, and then the door of that borrowed life closed behind them. Owen took the situation quietly, the way he took most things, setting his jaw, calculating, moving forward. Sadie watched him load their wagon without complaint and felt a fierce tenderness for the steadiness in him. She said nothing about being frightened, because there was no use in it. But she was. They had a wagon, 2 horses, a reasonable collection of tools, their wedding trunk, $62 in cash, and no particular destination. Owen had heard talk among ranch hands about homestead land opening up through the mountain valleys to the west, timber country, well-watered, not yet carved up by the large outfits. The government was still offering claims up there to anyone willing to prove and work them. That was the plan, loose as it was. Get through the mountains, find the land office in the town of Harwick on the other side, and file before winter locked the high passes. The mountain road was slower than they expected. October came early and cold that year, the pines draped in mist each morning, the trail turning to mud after every rain. Their progress slowed to a crawl. Owen studied the sky. Sadie made calculations about their flour and cornmeal. They were not in danger, but they were not comfortable either, and the farther they climbed, the more remote the country around them became. They spoke little about worry. Instead, they talked about what they wanted to build: a house on a south-facing slope, a kitchen garden, room enough to breathe. They heard it before they saw it, a low, constant thunder from somewhere ahead and to the left, beneath the trail, growing louder as the horses climbed. Owen pulled the wagon to the crest of a ridge, and both of them looked down into a narrow gorge where a waterfall dropped, perhaps 60 feet into a churning pool below, the spray catching the late afternoon light in curtains of white mist. It was the most beautiful thing Sadie had seen since leaving the low country. "We camp here tonight," Owen said, and there was no argument. They made their fire on a flat shelf of rock above the gorge. As the light failed and the waterfall roared its steady roar, Sadie sat watching the cliff face behind the falling water, and something made her lean forward and look harder. She mentioned it to Owen after supper. "There's a gap in the rock behind the water," she said. "I've been watching it since we sat down. It's not just shadow. There's a space there." Owen looked across the gorge through the last gray light. He was quiet for a moment, considering. "Could just be the cliff face," he said. "It could be," Sadie agreed, "but it doesn't look like the rest of the cliff face." He studied it another moment. "Dark already. We'd have to cross down to the pool to get close enough." "I know that," she said. "I'm not saying tonight. In the morning, she was up before him, standing at the edge of the shelf with her arms folded against the cold, looking at the cliff again. The daylight confirmed what the firelight had hinted. There was a definite shadow line where the rock behind the waterfall didn't meet cleanly. A vertical seam, deeper than the surrounding stone, wide enough perhaps for a person to pass through sideways. Owen came up beside her with coffee and followed her gaze. He said nothing for a full minute. "We've got time to look," Sadie said. "The road isn't going anywhere. We're behind schedule already. By a day, maybe 2. She glanced at him. "When was the last time you were curious about something and didn't look?" He didn't answer that, which was answer enough. They picked their way carefully down to the pool. The spray soaked them to the skin before they were halfway there. The rocks were slick with moss, and the sound was enormous this close, not just heard but felt, a vibration in the chest. Owen held Sadie's arm as they worked along the edge of the pool toward the cliff. The gap was real. Standing before it, they could feel cooler air moving outward from the seam in the rock, which meant the space beyond was deeper than a simple hollow. The gap was perhaps 18 inches wide, the stone on either side dark with moisture. Owen looked at it, then at Sadie. "Sideways," she said. "Could be nothing." "Could be," she said, already turning to fit herself through. She went first, pressing her back to one face of the rock and her hands to the other, shuffling sideways through the narrow passage. The roar of the waterfall fell behind her. The stone was cold and wet and very close, and then, after perhaps 12 feet, it opened. She stopped. She stared. Owen came through a moment later, straightening up, and he stopped beside her. Behind the waterfall, set back against the protected base of the cliff, stood a cabin. It was small and dark, and wrapped in the silence of a place that had not heard a human voice in a very long time. But it was standing. They stood together in the mist-softened light of that hidden space, and something moved between them without words. A recognition of the kind that comes only a few times in a life. Sadie reached for Owen's hand, and he took it. They had met at a church social in a Kansas town 3 years before. They had waited, saved, and married as soon as they honestly could. They had been looking for a place ever since. Neither of them said so yet. But they were both thinking the same thing. The cabin was perhaps 30 feet long and 18 wide, built directly against the base of the cliff so that the stone face formed its entire back wall. Whoever had raised it here had fitted the front and side walls from hewn pine logs, tight-jointed and carefully chinked with a mixture of clay and moss that had held remarkably well. The roof was pitched steeply, covered in hand-split shingles, and along one edge a line of them had lifted where a branch had come down at some point, leaving a patch where the weather had gotten in. But the ridge beam was straight. The walls had not moved. Owen walked the perimeter slowly, pressing his hands against the logs, looking up at the eave line, tapping with his knuckle at corners and joints. Sadie watched him do what he did when he was truly interested in something. Go quiet and thorough. "She's sound," he said finally. "Needs that roof section and some rechinching on the south wall. But she's sound." The door was simple plank construction, hung on iron hinges that had rusted a deep orange, but had not failed. It was not locked, only latched from outside with a wooden peg dropped through an iron loop. Owen lifted the peg. The door swung inward on a groan. The smell that met them was dry stone, old ash, and pine, not the smell of rot, which was the first good sign. Sadie stepped in ahead of him. The single main room held a stone fireplace built into the cliff wall itself, which meant it drew through natural channels in the rock and required no outside chimney. On either side of the fireplace were built-in shelves, still holding an assortment of objects: a tin cup, a small wooden box, several jars sealed with wax, a folded piece of oilcloth, a lantern with a cracked chimney glass. In the corner stood a narrow bed frame with rope lashing, the rope still strung and functional. A plain table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. Beneath the table, someone had stored a small crate of hand tools: a hatchet, 2 chisels, a draw knife, coils of wire, wrapped carefully in canvas. Sadie moved to the shelves and lifted one of the sealed jars. Inside were seeds. She lifted another. More seeds, different sizes. She began to count the jars quietly. Owen crouched at the fireplace and looked up the draw. "It's clear," he said, with something like wonder in his voice. "Owen." He turned. Sadie was holding a folded piece of paper that she had found tucked inside the oilcloth. On the outside, in a careful, old-fashioned hand, was written, "To whoever finds this place and enters with honest intent." They looked at each other. "Read it," he said. She unfolded it and began. The letter was 2 pages, written in the same deliberate hand. The author gave his name as Aldis Puit, a name neither of them recognized. He wrote that he had built this cabin in 1861, in the years before the war, when he had come west alone as a younger man with nothing but tools and the will to use them. He had lived here for over 20 years, he wrote, finding the hidden location a remarkable stroke of fortune, sheltered from wind and storm by the cliff, watered by a spring that fed directly into the cabin's stone channel, protected from the harshest of the mountain winters by the mass of rock behind. He had been happy here, he wrote, in the way that a person who asks little of the world and receives much from silence can be happy. But he had grown old. His knees had given. He could not keep the place properly any longer, and he had no children, no family remaining who would come. He had filed a deed on the property through the land office in Harwick, and he had left it here deliberately, because he had a particular wish about who should have it. He did not want it to go to the first person who arrived with money and legal claim. He wanted it to go to the first person who found it. Sadie's voice was steady as she read, but Owen could see her hands had tightened on the paper. Aldis Puit wrote that he had thought about this for years. A person who found the cabin by accident and chose to enter honestly, who did not break the door, who did not take the tools and leave, who stayed long enough to read the letter. That was the person he had in mind. He had enclosed the deed, properly drawn and witnessed by the Harwick Land Office, transferring ownership to the bearer of this letter upon registration, provided they intend to work and inhabit the land. He asked only one thing, that whoever inherited the place care for it the way it had cared for him. "You are standing in a good house," he wrote at the close. "The spring does not fail. The soil in the sheltered flat to the east grows kitchen crops without much coaxing. I have left what I could. The rest, you will find yourself. I hope you are young. I hope you are not alone. I hope this place gives you what it gave me, which was time enough to know what matters." Sadie folded the letter carefully and held it against her coat. The silence between them was the particular kind that follows something enormous. "There's a deed," Owen said, not quite a question. She unfolded the second sheet. It was on heavier paper, official in its form, with 2 signatures below the transfer language and a date of 1883, 6 years ago. Puit had filed this and left it here 6 years ago and waited, apparently, for the right 2 people to walk through the rock. Owen stood up slowly. He went to the door and looked out at the sheltered space around the cabin, the natural courtyard formed by the cliff on 3 sides, the roar of the waterfall a constant at the edge of hearing, the tall pines that grew along the eastern edge where the ground leveled into exactly the kind of flat Pruitt had described. He came back inside. He sat down in one of the old chairs, and it held his weight without complaint. "We were going to Harwick anyway," Sadie said quietly. "To file a claim," Owen said. "This is a claim." He turned the thought over carefully, the way he turned all serious things, thoroughly, without rushing. "If the deed is legitimate?" "It reads legitimate. We'd need the land office to confirm. That's a day's ride from here, maybe less." She paused. "Owen, the spring. Did you see it?" He had not. She led him to the north wall, where, near the base of the cliff, a narrow stone channel had been carved directly into the rock floor of the cabin, barely 4 inches wide and 2 deep, running from a crack in the cliff face to a collection basin fitted with a flat stone cover. Sadie lifted the cover. Cold, clean water ran steadily in the channel, barely a trickle but constant. "That's the spring he wrote about," she said. Owen put his hand in it. The water was cold enough to ache. They found the storage room that afternoon, a natural hollow in the cliff face behind the cabin, accessible through a low door that Owen had initially taken for a root cellar entrance. It was larger than expected, perhaps 10 feet deep and 8 wide, carved smooth by human hands, with wooden shelving along both sides. Half the shelves were empty, but on the lowest level, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with pine tar, were provisions left deliberately: a tin of salt, dried beans in a sealed jar, cornmeal in a waxed sack, a small tin of axle grease, several coils of good hemp rope, a folded wool blanket. Sadie stood in the doorway of that small room and looked at the careful rows of stored things and felt something she had not felt in a very long time: the specific, quiet warmth of being provided for. "He thought of everything," she said. "He thought of us," Owen said. "He just didn't know our names yet." They slept in the cabin that night. Owen patched the cracked lantern chimney with a wrap of wire, and they ate their own provisions by its light, sitting at Aldis Puit's table in Aldis Puit's chairs, with the deed folded inside Sadie's coat, and the waterfall speaking its constant language beyond the rock. There was a moment, late, when Owen looked across the table at his wife in the amber light and said simply, "I think this is it." Sadie looked back at him. The fireplace, their fireplace, threw warmth across the old stone walls. "I think so too," she said. They were not passing through anymore. Morning brought practical thinking, which was Owen's natural response to anything that moved him. The roof section was the first order. 3 shingles had lifted along a patch near the north eave, and below that point, the ceiling log showed a water stain about the size of a dinner plate. It had not compromised the timber. The wood beneath was still firm, but left another winter it would. Owen found a cache of spare shingles in the storage room, stacked flat and still serviceable, which Pruitt had apparently left against exactly this contingency. Replacing them required hauling his weight up to the roof line on a ladder they improvised from the remaining pine lengths stored against the cabin's east wall. Sadie held the base while Owen worked, and the wind came up around mid-morning and made the whole arrangement uncomfortable. But by noon, the patch was done, and the line was true. They rechinked the south wall together, mixing the clay from the gorge bank with dried moss and water, the way Pruitt's letter had described in a practical footnote Sadie had almost overlooked. It was slow, unglamorous work, pressing the mixture into the gaps with their fingers, smoothing it flat, working section by section from the foundation upward. Their hands were dark with clay by midday, and the cold made the work stiffer as the afternoon wore on, but the result, when they stepped back to look, was solid. Sadie found the problem with the water channel on the second day. The collection basin was clear, but about 4 feet up the channel, a crack in the stone lip had allowed sediment to accumulate and narrow the flow to less than half its natural width. She spent the better part of a morning carefully clearing it with one of the chisels from the tool crate, chipping sediment loose in small, careful strokes while the cold water ran over her fingers. When the channel was clear, the flow in the basin nearly doubled. "There," she said, to no one in particular, because Owen was outside splitting wood. She stood up and flexed her cold hands and looked at the water running cleanly through the carved channel and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing restored to proper function. Owen had his own concerns about the eastern flat. The soil Puit had described was real, dark, deep, noticeably richer than the rocky ground elsewhere in the gorge. But 2 seasons of unmanaged brush growth had encroached significantly from the tree line. The flat itself was perhaps a 1/4 acre, sheltered on 3 sides by the cliff and the gorge walls, open to the south and its light. It could be considerably more productive than a 1/4 acre, Owen judged, if the brush was pushed back. But that was spring work. What he could do now was clear the immediate ground nearest the cabin, trace the boundaries of the flat, turn a strip of soil to see how deep the good layer ran. He dug a test hole 18 inches down. The soil was dark all the way. They had also to reckon with the question of the road. The wagon and horses were still tethered on the shelf above the gorge, exposed to the weather. There was no way to bring a wagon down to the pool level, and certainly no way to bring it through the passage in the cliff. What they could move through the gap, they had been moving in careful loads. Their trunk, their tools, their provisions. But the wagon itself would have to be stabled above, which meant that for the time being, they were committed to living below. "Doesn't trouble me," Sadie said, when they discussed it. Owen looked at her. "It's not a hardship," she said. "It's just a climb." The ride to Harwick took them the better part of a long day, down from the mountains on a road that was only occasionally that. The land office was a low building on the main street, sided in weathered board, with a wood stove burning hard against the October cold. The clerk was a compact man named Fessler, who wore a canvas vest and spectacles and gave every impression of having reviewed a great many documents and been surprised by very few of them. Owen set the deed on the counter and explained the situation plainly. Fessler read the transfer language carefully. He read it again. He turned the page over and examined the witnesses' signatures. He reached behind him for a ledger and ran his finger down a column of entries, going back several pages, then going back farther. "Aldis Puit," he said. "Yes, sir," Owen said. "Filed this deed in the fall of 1883. It's recorded here." He tapped the ledger. "No subsequent transfer, no tax lien. Property taxes on the parcel were paid forward by Puit at the time of filing, 10 years in advance." He looked up over his spectacles. "Which means they run through 1893. Sadie felt Owen's arm tighten slightly at her side. She kept her face composed. "The transfer language is unusual," Fessler continued, "but it's not irregular. I've seen conditional transfers before. This one stipulates intent to inhabit and work. Can you demonstrate that?" "We've been there 4 days," Owen said. "We've repaired the roof, re-chinked the walls, cleared the water channel, and begun preparing the soil plot." Fessler regarded him for a moment over the spectacles. "You did all that in 4 days." "We had reason to," Owen said. Fessler looked at Sadie, who said nothing and looked back at him with a calm, level expression that apparently satisfied some question he was asking himself. He looked at the deed again. He uncapped his pen. "I'll need your full names and today's date, and I'll record the transfer in the ledger. You'll want to keep both this deed and the registration copy I'll make you in a safe place." He paused. "A dry one, if you're living behind a waterfall." "We've got a storage room cut into solid rock," Sadie said. Something moved across Fessler's face that might, on another face, have been a smile. "Then you'll do fine." The recording took perhaps 20 minutes. When it was done, Owen folded their copy of the registered deed inside his coat, and they walked out of the land office into the cold October street. They stood on the board sidewalk for a moment. A wagon rolled past. A dog crossed at the far corner. The mountains were visible to the east, blue and close. "Mercer property," Sadie said quietly, trying the sound of it. "Mercer property," Owen agreed. They bought supplies before leaving town. Flour, salt pork, dried beans, candle tallow, a new chimney glass for the lantern, and a small packet of vegetable seeds from the general store's end-of-season remnants. The storekeeper was dubious about planting so late in the season, and Owen agreed with him politely, without explaining that they were not planting until spring. Sadie bought a bolt of heavy wool flannel and a paper of pins. She did not explain that either. They were back on the mountain road before noon, the horses loaded, the light beginning its long autumn slant toward the west. Neither of them spoke much. There was a particular quality to the silence between two people who have just received something they have wanted for a very long time and have not yet learned to carry it easily. They were within an hour of the gorge when the weather turned. The sky closed over without much warning, the way mountain weather can, and by the time they reached the upper shelf, the rain was serious and the temperature had dropped sharply. The trail back down to the pool was treacherous in the wet. Owen led the horses slowly, feeling for footing, while Sadie moved just behind him. Owen's boots slipped on a moss-covered stone. He caught himself on a branch, nothing more than a jolt and a badly twisted ankle. But he went down on one knee, and his jaw was tight when he stood up again. A long night lay ahead. They made it to the passage in the cliff, just as the rain became truly heavy. The waterfall amplified to something almost overwhelming, the spray soaking them the moment they reached the pool. Getting through the gap with Owen's ankle was awkward and slow. He leaned on the stone wall and moved carefully, and Sadie went first, and then reached back through and braced for his weight. And it was clumsy and cold, and neither of them said anything about how cold it was. Inside the cabin, Sadie had the fire lit inside of 10 minutes. Owen sat in the chair, Pruitt's chair, their chair, with his boot off and his ankle elevated on the crate, and the color came back into his face by degrees. The rain hammered the cliff outside. The waterfall roared. But inside the cabin, the stone walls held perfectly. The chimney drew clean and hot, and the lantern with its new glass threw a steady amber circle across the old table, and the clay-chinked logs, and the shelves with their jars of seeds. Owen looked around the room, at the fireplace built into solid rock, at the water running quietly in its stone channel, at Sadie, her hair damp, her hands already warm again, the deed folded safe in the oilcloth on the highest shelf. He had been afraid in the rain for just a moment, afraid they might lose this. Sadie made tea from the provisions and set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table. "It's registered," she said. Not as reassurance exactly, as fact. He nodded. "We'll sort the ankle by morning. The supplies are through." The roof held. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "We're all right, Owen." He looked at her across the old table in the warm light, the waterfall speaking beyond the rock, the fire steady behind her. "We are," he said. In the weeks that followed, They settled into the rhythms of the hidden place the way a person settles into a well-made coat, gradually, and then all at once. Owen's ankle was sore for 4 days, and then it was not. He bore this with characteristic silence. Sadie bore the additional hauling those 4 days required with characteristic competence, and there was a particular understanding that passed between them during that time. The understanding that two people have when they discover they can depend on each other in the specific, unglamorous ways that actually matter. The cabin took shape around them. The water channel, now fully clear, fed the basin steadily through every weather. They fitted a carved stone lid over the basin to keep it clean, which Owen cut from a flat piece of gray granite found along the gorge wall. Sadie set the lid at a slight angle to let any overflow run back down the channel, which was a detail Pruitt had apparently left for whoever came next, because there was a carved groove in exactly the right position that she had assumed was decorative. It was not decorative. It was engineering. "He was a careful man," Sadie said. "He was counting on us to be careful too," Owen said. They found another of Pruitt's careful provisions when Owen pulled the tool crate fully away from under the table to take inventory. Beneath where the crate had stood, set into the floor logs, was a small, hinged panel. Not hidden, exactly, but not obvious. Under it was a compartment about the size of a large bread box, lined in tin to keep it dry, and inside were 3 items: a folded survey map of the property with careful annotations in Pruitt's hand, a small notebook filled with observations about the land across the 4 seasons, first frost dates, snowfall depths, the angle of light at midsummer, which direction the wind came from in each month, and a clean envelope containing a second letter. This letter was shorter. "If you have made it this far," Pruitt wrote, "you are already doing better than I expected." The map shows the full extent of the property, which is larger than the immediate gorge. The east flat is only the beginning. There is a south-facing slope above the cliff line, accessible by the trail that begins at the north end of the sheltered space, that receives more sun than anywhere below. I meant to do more with it. Perhaps you will. The notebook is my record of 30 years here. Use what is useful and disregard the rest. The first frost generally comes to the low gorge in mid-October, but the cabin holds its warmth well into November if you keep the fire fed. You are protected from the main winds. You will need less wood than you think. I am glad someone is reading this. That means the place is not forgotten. A. Pruitt. Owen read it twice and then set it down very carefully. "There's a slope," he said. "There's a slope," Sadie agreed. They found the trail Pruitt had described on a clear afternoon in early November, after the first snow had dusted the upper elevations and retreated again, leaving the air bright and sharp. The trail climbed the north end of the sheltered space and switchbacked up through a break in the cliff that they had not noticed from below, opening after about 200 feet of steep going onto a wide bench of land that faced directly south. Owen stood at the edge of it and turned slowly. The bench was perhaps 3 acres, mostly clear, the soil dark with pine needle duff that turned would be excellent. To the south, the mountain fell away, and the view opened over 50 miles of lowland valley, blue and gold in the autumn afternoon. The sun hit the bench directly, and the warmth was immediately noticeable after the shade of the gorge below. He did not say anything for a long time. Sadie came and stood beside him and looked out over the valley, and then up at the bench, and then back at the valley again. "Spring," she said. "Spring," he agreed. November deepened. The mornings became cold enough to see their breath inside the cabin before the fire was lit, and they learned quickly the particular order of things that made the hidden place comfortable: Fire first, then water, then food, then the day's work. The fireplace warmed the room in less than 30 minutes when properly laid. The stone walls held the heat well after the fire was banked at night. The wool blanket from Pruitt's storage room went over their own bedding and made the difference. Sadie hemmed curtains from the flannel she had bought in Harwick and hung them on the windows. Owen built a second shelf beside the fireplace from boards split from a downed pine behind the gorge. She arranged their provisions on the new shelf, the Harwick supplies alongside the remaining jars of Pruitt seeds, and the two sets of things together made the room look inhabited in the way that matters. Not like a shelter, but like a home. One evening in late November, Owen came in from splitting wood and stood in the doorway a moment before entering, the way he sometimes did, and looked at the room, at the lamp on the table and the fire in the stone hearth and the curtains Sadie had made, at his wife reading Pruitt's notebook by the light, her stockinged feet tucked under her, at the jars on the shelf and the deed behind them in its oilcloth, and all the careful, ordinary evidence of a life accumulating. Sadie looked up and saw him standing there. "Come in," she said. "You're letting the cold in." He smiled and shut the door behind him. Later that night, after the fire was banked and Sadie slept, Owen stepped outside into the sheltered courtyard and stood in the dark. The waterfall was a pale curtain in the moonlight, roaring its steady roar, the spray cool on his face. The cliff rose on 3 sides, solid and permanent. The cabin windows glowed amber behind him. He thought about Aldis Puit, who had built this place with careful hands and given it to strangers he would never meet, trusting that the right ones would find it. They had found it. Owen Mercer stood in the dark behind the waterfall in front of his own home and felt, for the first time in his life, completely still.